this morning. This morning I would like to continue our thoughts that I shared last week along the lines of hanging by a thread. There are times in our lives where we feel like we might be hanging by a thread. So I want to continue that thought in a lesson entitled Suffering, Sickness, and Sin. Suffering, sickness, and sin. If you turn your Bibles to James chapter 1, most of our text will be this morning from James chapter 1 and in verses 2 through 12. James is one of my favorite books in the Bible, particularly the New Testament, because it's such a practical, straightforward book. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 12 says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower falls, and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him." So I want to think about this. I want us to consider the trials that come our way. And again, I was thinking somewhat of Dennis, but in thinking of that, we all face trials and tribulations. And truthfully, I suppose I'm in a better place in my life now than I have been in a long time. But it never hurts for us to study this, because we might be going along just perfectly fine. And just as Job in last week's lesson, we may just have the legs cut straight out from under us. And it might be allowed to happen. Now, I want us to consider, as long as there is sin, any kind of sin in the world, suffering, sickness will be here as well, and that will be in an abundance. Adam and Eve introduced sin into the world in the Garden of Eden, and from that point in time, with the introduction of sin, came death. With death came sickness. With sin, the separation of man from God. And with that separation of man from God, there came a sense of that sin. There became sorrow, pain, agony. All of it hinges on sin, not necessarily our personal sin, but sin of humanity. In Romans chapter 3, I want us to begin here and look at what Paul has to say about sin in the world. Romans chapter 3 and in verse 8, the Apostle Paul says this. He says, "And why not do evil that good may come? As some people scandalously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just." Paul says in verse 9, he says, "What then are Jews? Any better off? Not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are under sin. As it is written, none is righteous, no, not one. No one understands, no one seeks for God. They have all turned aside, together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one. Now, if you will, drop down with me. I'm not going to take time to read the entire section through verse 18 this morning, but I do want to clip on verse 23, where Paul again concludes this: for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. It is human beings. We are weak, we are frail, and we are sinful. We will sin throughout our lives from time to time. What do we do, though, when trouble comes to call? What do we do when sickness, suffering, and sin come to call in our lives? I want you to notice with me back in the book of James, James chapter 1, and in verse 2, the word when is printed there. Not if, not should, not perhaps, but when. When, James says, when you meet with trials of various kinds. This is God's way of making a guarantee. I want you to notice something that Job, during his suffering, writes in Job chapter 14. Job continues his commentary in chapter 14 and verse 1 by saying this: man who is born of a woman is few of days and full of trouble. He comes out like a flower and withers. He flees like a shadow and continues not. Job is saying that our days, no matter who we are, no matter what status in life we may have, our days are few and filled with trouble. There are two kinds of trials, if you will, allow me to separate them as such: outward trials and inward trials. Now, the outward trials are normally from outside sources, and we have little or no control over them at all. Now, these trials, the inward trials, are normally from within us. Our emotions or our feelings, the same as outward trials, again, we have very little control over them. Although I believe that we probably have a little bit more control over the inward trials than the outward trials, but still, oftentimes things happen to us not because we have done anything to deserve them or anything wrong, although that might be the case, but things happen in our lives and we have very little control over it. The outward trials are made up of, again, I don't have them, hang on, my notes are missing. The outward trials are made up of things such as hardships, grief, pain, sickness, and disappointment. The inward trials are made up of things such as uneasiness, rejection, anger, perhaps even rage, desires, or you might say lust, and rejection. These are all emotional trials. Inward trials are more emotional and feelings. The outward trials are more physical in nature. Count it all joy. And I'm telling you what, when I was a kid, I used to think, what in the cat hair is James talking about? James is saying when he writes, count it all joy. What does that mean? He says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet various trials of various kinds. Now, I'm telling you, this is just backwards from human thinking. But when we examine what a trial is a faith exercise. Remember that, kids. A trial is a faith exercise. It is designed by God or used by God to strengthen the inner man, to strengthen our character, our personalities. So when God sends you a trial, don't reject it. Don't reject it. It's a trial. It's going to hurt. It's going to be painful. Our human side of us is going to say, remove it. The Apostle Paul says he was given a thorn in the flesh. 3 times he prayed to God to remove it. God said, my grace is sufficient for thee. Seize the opportunity. No matter what it might feel like, how miserable you might be, seize the opportunity to grow. Now, there were a few things that I disliked more as a child than spelling. Spelling is the worst subject that any student will ever have to study. And Kate will tell you to this day I cannot spell. My mother used to spend hours with me with spelling books. And I used to whine and complain. Today, I wish I had paid more attention. I would have been better off for it. I looked at that as a trial in my life, and I rejected it. Maybe we should look at trials as a free membership to the gym. I suspect none of us here are interested in a free membership to the gym. But why do people do it? People join the YMCA. People join a local fitness center because they want to improve their body. They want to improve their health. And so they pay to be miserable. That's really what it amounts to. As far as I can tell, that's what a gym membership is. It's where someone pays to sweat. To hurt. But use the trials with the purpose in mind that when it's over, you're going to be the superstar of your day. You'll have muscles where you should have muscles, and you won't have fat where you shouldn't have fat. It improves your status in life. I want to talk to you for a moment about learning to live above trials. Or maybe you might say with trials. I want to hone in on 3 words in the text. Count, actually 4, I guess. Well, 3. Depending on your translation, it will be count or consider, depending on the translation you're reading. Know and ask. 3 words. Count or consider. James says, count it all joy, my brothers. Or consider it all joy, depending on your translation. James doesn't say there is anything joyful about being beat up for Christ. He doesn't say that there's any pleasantry in having the rug pulled out from under you, so to speak, in life. But to treat it as if trials were joyful by being, get this, being satisfied. Being satisfied does not necessarily mean that we don't want the trial to end, but being satisfied is something the Christian should do in everything in life. It doesn't mean that we don't seek to improve our lives. It doesn't mean that we should, but it means that we accept what God has allowed to be in our lives, trusting God, Understanding that there is good that can come out of this. Understand God has a purpose for allowing it. Just as Job had trials in his life, Job did not understand. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that we really honestly understand why God allowed Job to be tried. Not fully, not really. But we have a glimpse into the mind of God. And God allowed it to happen. God allows us. God doesn't necessarily cause us to be tried. Satan brings about the misery. But God has a way of taking what Satan does, and when we get through it, he turns it and makes it into something good. Remember that. No. The second word I want us to find is found here in the book of James. No. If you're thinking about the word no, it appears several times. Verse 3 says, "For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." Let's just go with that one right there. No. Knowing something means that we have an understanding of it, a knowledge of it. God doesn't always let us see things from his perspective. But here, in this text, we get a glimpse of things through God's eyes. We see the outcome. For you know the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. You mean to tell me, James, that I can't be perfect if I don't have trials? There is a concept that is found throughout the scriptures. Gold tried by fire. I want you to think about that for a moment. Where the scriptures talk about gold in the refiner's fire. Now, many years ago when I was very young, I had the opportunity to go out west to visit an aunt and uncle that I have living in Utah. And while we were there, we stopped in Colorado. If I were to move out west, Colorado might be a state that I would consider. But when we were in Colorado, we took the opportunity of touring a gold mine by the name of the Molly Kathleen Gold Mine. We got to go hundreds of feet below ground. We got to hold gold ore in our hand. And somewhere, I'm sure my mother still has my hunk of gold ore. I'm pretty sure it's worthless, because they would never let us take something back as tourists for the price that we paid if it was worth anything. But nevertheless, it looks like, for all the world, like a hunk of rock. Oh, there's a little sparkle to it, but it doesn't look anything at all like gold that we see used to make beautiful things. Or a gold coin. It looks nothing like that. It has to be refined. It has to go through a heating process in which the impurities are burned up. Trials are the burning up of our personal impurities. I found a quote from a man that I thought was really hit this on the head. Everything that I've learned in life has been learned through affliction and not through happiness. Remember, there is a difference between joy and happiness. When James says, count it all joy, he doesn't mean that we're going to wake up one morning under trials and tribulations and be like, la da 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 da. Cloud nine. James does not mean that. But oftentimes we learn lessons through adversity that are lessons that need to be learned. And we become wiser, better, stronger individuals because of it. It's knowing that allows us, it's knowing the outcome, knowing what James says, knowing the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. It's knowing that. It's knowing the outcome. It's knowing that it's temporary that will allow us to accept and embrace the hardships. Because let's face it, life stinks. But it will allow us to accept and embrace them because we know, we have a knowledge of what God has in mind. Thirdly, ask. What does Jesus say? Ask and you will receive. James expands on this in verse 5. James tells us very specifically in the context of trials what it is that we are to ask for. And this builds on knowing. It builds on our knowledge. If any of you lacks wisdom, wisdom, friends, is the knowledge of God. Let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. If you're going through a trial, a difficult time in your life, physically or spiritually, ask of God. Ask of God, and he will give you knowledge. Now, there's criteria there that we're not going to go into. Read it. Read that paragraph, verses 5 through 8. Read that paragraph and God will tell you the strings that are attached. He will give you as he gives to all men liberally, but there are conditions. That having been said, wisdom is housed in the mind of our great God. There is no one wiser, no one more knowledgeable than God who created everything. We do not learn wisdom. We do not learn it. Wisdom, knowledge we learn. Wisdom is not learned. We can only grasp what God gives us as far as wisdom. Remember Solomon. Solomon didn't learn wisdom. It was a gift from God. You and I can't learn wisdom. It is a gift from God. We have to ask for that gift. And we have to accept it on his terms. Wisdom has been defined as looking at the world through God's eyes. Seeing what God sees. Understanding what God understands. I think that's a pretty good definition of wisdom. Welcome to Greek class. Steadfastness. I love the Greek language. I love to look back because it gives us a little bit more insight. James says that we should be steadfast. He says the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. This is the whole thing of trials. The whole idea behind trials is it's going to produce a steadfastness. Some of your translations may render it a little bit differently, a little different wording. But the word that is translated steadfastness, or in some translations differently, I believe endures, maybe is the way the King James Version renders it. It's a combination of two Greek words. Usually we have word-for-word translation, but in this case, they've taken two Greek words and rolled it into one. Hupo means under. Meno means to abide or remain. Those are the two Greek words. Now, interestingly enough, and this is what piques my interest, you have to understand the time period in which James is writing to us. And James is encouraging the Christian to hupomeno, to remain under our burdens, to remain under our burdens and willingly accept the load God places, or in some cases, allow Satan to place on us. Plodding along, waiting until the master lifts the load from our shoulders. Now that term, to remain under, if you're in English, or if you're Greek, you would say hupomeno, was a term that was used in James's day. It was a term used to refer to a pack animal, that they were to remain under their load, to remain under their load until the end of the journey. When the Apostle Paul did missionary journeys, in all likelihood, the Bible doesn't tell us this for sure, but in all likelihood, Paul had a pack animal, probably a donkey, because Jews did not use mules. Mules were to breed mules was a violation of the Old Testament law. So probably the Apostle Paul used donkeys. And that to remain under the load was a term that was used to describe a pack animal. Now, what do we expect when we get through trials? We expect to be blessed, blessed, blessed. But is that enough? Everyone understands the value of exercise. But at the end of a good workout, I don't know about you, the older I get, the worse it gets. At the end of a day on the roofing crew, I'm stiff and sore. My muscles are screaming that I don't work like I used to. When you come through a trial, at the end of that trial, you might be stiff, you might be sore, you might feel like you've been beat up. The truth is, there's a saying in the physical therapy area: no pain, no gain. Without pain, we don't strengthen our muscles. Without use, our muscles become weaker and not stronger. Without trials, our lives remain weak. Trials strengthen us. It makes us more capable and better Christians and better individuals. God promises us a crown. Literal or figurative, I do not know. But I want you to consider, in the Bible, there are 5 crowns in the New Testament. There are 5 of them listed in the Scriptures, given for accomplishments. I want you to think about that. James, right here in verse 12, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. That's one. We're going to look at all 5 of these crowns very quickly. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, there is an imperishable crown. The Apostle Paul speaks of an imperishable crown as he draws a parallel between an athletic competition and the Christian's walk with God. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 24. Read this very quickly with me. Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath or crown, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified or a castaway. Paul is working to receive an imperishable crown, a crown of rejoicing. Paul writes about this crown in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. And again, very quickly, so that we have a good concept of what Paul is talking about, let's go back here to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 17. Here the Apostle Paul says this, "But since we were torn away from you, brothers, for a short time, in person, not in heart, we endeavor the more eagerly and with great desire to see you face to face. Because we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, again and again, but Satan hindered us. For what is our hope, or joy, or crown of boasting?" Now, the English Standard Version says crown of boasting. Most translations say it's a crown of rejoicing. Before our Lord at his coming, is it not you? For you are our glory and our joy. Paul says Christians, the brethren, are his crown of rejoicing. Next, there's a crown of righteousness. The Apostle Paul, when he is about to be beheaded, to be killed for Christ. Now, you can imagine if we're talking about trials. The Apostle Paul is about to be killed for Christ. And he writes about a crown to his beloved apprentice, Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7. Paul says, "I've fought a good fight. I've finished my race. I've kept the faith. Henceforth is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not to me only, but to all who have loved his appearing." The crown of glory. Peter, 1 Peter chapter 5, writes about this crown of glory. 1 Peter chapter 5 and in verse 1, Peter says, "So I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder, a witness to the sufferings of Christ, as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed, shepherd the flock of God that is among you. Exercise oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those who are in your charge, but being an example to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive an unfading crown of glory." This is a crown given for the elders of a local body. Elders who have shepherded the flock of God as good shepherds. A crown of glory. And again, the crown of life mentioned in James is also mentioned in the book of Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10. John in the book of Revelation 2 and verse 10 says, "Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life." So we have an imperishable crown, a rejoicing crown, a crown of righteousness, a crown of glory, and a crown of life. Figurative or literal, I still am on the fence. Nevertheless, there are rewards for those who overcome. Our closing verse this morning, as we think about our trials and tribulations and overcoming those things, because that's the whole point of it, is overcoming trials makes us better people. Our closing verse is Romans chapter 8. And in verse 18, the Apostle Paul says, "For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." The sufferings of today are not worth comparing. There's no comparison to what we may suffer in this life what is going to be tomorrow. There is no comparing the suffering of this life to what is going to be in eternity, forever. John in the book of Revelation says he's going to wipe away all tears. There'll be no more sorrow nor crying, for the things are passed away. I want to encourage you to take out your red songbook again this time.